Um, Pete, in Mark's gospel, we find the first mention of what will also be mentioned in other places in the Synoptics, that Jesus is warning, Caesarea Philippi is probably one of the more popular ones. Jesus is warning his disciples not to let the people know that he is the Messiah, that he is Christos. And some have said, oh, well, Jesus didn't really believe in his messiahship. This kind of got foisted on him. And a lot of Hollywood filmmakers have had some experience with this. Talk to us about your take on this, and how do we see a deeper truth there?
Well, the secrecy motif has been kind of much discussed, especially in the last century. And I'll tell you, the person who really kind of got the ball rolling on that whole thing is not someone that almost anybody likes. And his scholar by the name of Wilhelm Reda, another German guy, one of those sort of late 19th century, early 20th century kind of more corrosive, caustic critics of the gospel tradition. He was the person who kind of not only took the idea that there is this secrecy motif in Mark, and let's be honest, it does show up a little bit in Matthew. I think it might be mentioned once in Luke.
But it's primary in Mark,
it's primarily a Markan theme, right? It does tend to fade away in Matthew and Luke, right? Neither one of them really has as much use for it.
Nor in John at all.
No, it's not in John at all, because in John, of course, everybody basically knows who Jesus is, right? From the very beginning in John, at least in terms of his messianic identity, and even very strong intimations of his divinity. But what has to sort of be litigated out is, his enemy's kind of response to that, right? And so, he's very open about, the Baptist is very open about, Jesus existed before me, and he knows all these things about Jesus and stuff. From the very beginning, we find that he was in the beginning with God. So there's really no mystery there. The drama of John is sort of figuring out how the enemies of Jesus are going to ultimately react to the Christological claims. But in Mark's the one where the evangelist is by far the most cagey about Jesus's identity, and really makes the unfolding of that identity to a certain extent to the reader, but the reader really sort of knows more, because he does tell the reader in the very beginning, this is the beginning of the gospel, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So this is, it's not super mysterious for the reader, but there is a certain drama on having it be revealed. But anyway, Reda was the person who, basically argued, well, this was something that Mark, kind of concocted to explain how it is that a man historically who never claimed to be the Messiah, never thought he was the Messiah, never wanted anybody to think he was a Messiah, nevertheless, how we took that tradition and then sort of foisted this messianic identity onto him, and the secrecy motif was the way in which the evangelist, Mark himself, did this, and that was basically to sort of explain why it is that this man who no one in real life had any memory of being a Messiah, nevertheless was believed and preached as a Messiah by his followers afterwards. Now, I have never talked to anybody who believes that claim in any way, shape, or form. And if it were true, it would make Mark and really the other gospels, almost complete idiots in terms of the way they edited the whole story, right? If it were the case that you're trying to puff someone who's merely a man into a Messiah figure, the secrecy motif is just it's too it's way too complicated, and it's way too cagey, and it makes the whole thing just really not believable and stuff. But okay, so the original Das Messiah's Geheimnis, which was the Messianic secret, which Reda published, and I think he published it back in the early 20th century, I think 1905, something like that. Nobody believe this anymore, but almost any article on Mark on the Messianic secret will start out by citing Wilhelm Reda, precisely because Reda
Wrede, right?
yes, exactly.
Reda, yeah.
Yeah, and precisely because Reda really got the ball rolling in terms of understanding Mark not as just a boring, artless compiler of sort of unadorned, uncreatively put together facts that are just kind of there for us. That Matthew and Luke took and actually gave a literary structure to. Like everybody acknowledged in antiquity that Matthew had a literary structure, right? We'll see this next week when we get into Matthew. There are 5 distinct parts. There are 5 distinct blocks of
Torah
discourse.
and gospel,
exactly. And Luke, same thing, right? Luke has this extended travel sequence that takes up about half of the gospel, and that also was anticipated, was seen in antiquity, right? That both of these developments are literary artistry, right? That there's clearly a literary intentionality in the way that these two things were put together. But nobody saw anything interesting about Mark. Mark
was the Messianic secret in Mark something that the early adoptionist Christologies seized on, or was it not even mentioned? I can't remember.
That's a really good question.
Come on, Pete, you're supposed to know all this stuff.
Yeah, in terms of the like the Ebionites and the adoptions, I don't know. I don't think so, because
it was all just Jesus' baptism, and then Eloi, Eloi.
There's no extended buildup there. But anyway, but the point is, it's like after Reda, people started to take really seriously the Gospel of Mark as an intentional, really well put together literary composition of its own, even though Mark's grammar is a little rougher around the edges. Some of the details of the stories are very a little bit awkward from time to time. There's like little tidbits that are just kind of really mysterious. Like, why is it there? Like the naked man running away from the Garden of Gethsemane. Like, who is that? The
John Mark was a streaker. Wait a minute.
Who knows?
We don't know. Yeah.
It's So, but after Reda really got the ball rolling in terms of appreciating Mark as a really, really interesting gospel, even in his own right. And once you stopped, comparing Mark to Matthew and Luke, who do very, very different things and who do things that are very, very familiar to us, because much of our understanding of really what a gospel is comes from Matthew and Luke, right? Much of the ideas that we have about Jesus really come from those gospels. Mark has always been kind of the one that we, only talk about if someone else brings it up. Many of the church fathers were not really big on Mark. Augustine kind of contemptuously dismissed him as just a camp follower and a bridger of Matthew. But since then, both the new solution to the synoptic problem and also Wilhelm Reda was another aspect of this. Mark has really taken off. Markan scholarship has really, really taken off in the last century or so. And there's certainly been more written on Mark in the last century than in all previous centuries combined, by far. Couldn't even be close. Because Mark is actually really, really interesting when you don't assume he's coming after Matthew and Luke, because then he inevitably will be compared to them, and he never looks quite as good in comparison to them.
Well, it's like a setup, it's probably not his intention to do that. As a friend of mine who was a Syro-Palestinian archaeologist said, why it's good to marry an archaeologist? And the answer is no, tell me. And the answer is the older he or she gets, the more interesting they become. And maybe that's an explanation for Mark. There are, and the synoptic studies have recognized the amount of Aramaic. Are they loan words? Are they original words? Some kind of discussion there. I have always thought that spoke to an older gospel in the Markan priority. But there are hints of other aspects in this. Talk
Yeah.
about some of the
Yeah.
things that you've run across in there.
This is a so those of people who've done the lesson already, which is probably almost everybody, has seen that Mark has more Aramaic words that are in the Greek version of the gospel that came down to us, right? And so we're suggesting that itself is an element of evidence that at least is consistent with Mark being older than the others. We would expect there to be more Aramaic in the oldest gospel than in the newer ones, precisely because that's probably closer to the form in which the saying would have been remembered by an Aramaic speaking church. Jesus himself, we know, would have certainly spoken Aramaic from day to day. He probably also spoke Greek too, by the way, but at the time, Greek would have been more the lingua franca, like for public ministry, to do like an exposition or something like that, to preach in a synagogue,
especially in the Galilee, right? Yeah.
But when you're in private, or doing private prayer or in private settings, Aramaic would have certainly been the language spoken in home, and Mark gives us good evidence for that. But there's even a little bit more to it than that, because in Mark's gospel, in Mark chapter 1, verse 41, there's the story of Mark healing the leper.
Yep.
And so a leper comes to him, beseeching to him and kneeling him, saying, "And if you will, you make me clean." And then in verse 41, my RSV says, "Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him." Well, it turns out if you look at a critical commentary on verse 141, or even a good study Bible that has a list more than just the usual number of variants, you'll see that one of the possible ways of understanding this is not moved with pity, but moved with anger, moved with outrage. Wow. And now, apart from the issue about which is the better attested Greek verb here, most text critics will go with pity on this. That seems to be the best attested one in antiquity. But the question is, we have two different words in Greek that it could be. Some ancient traditions read anger, and the word anger is orgisthemai, and some read have compassion or have pity, which is splanknidzomai. Now, you take two words, orgisthemai, splanknidzomai, except for the ending of them, they're totally different words. There's no way, or there's no easy way to explain how one could have been confused for the other, right? It's easy to see how two words that are very similar could get confused. Sometimes two words that sound the same or sound very similar, one could be confused for the other, or the spelling are similar. These words are totally different, right? So the question would be, how could they possibly have been confused? Well, it turns out that in Aramaic, the word ethraham and ethraam are only off by a letter, but the first word in Aramaic means to have compassion on. The second word is a reflexive, which means to get angry. So those words are very, very similar. And if those words were somehow confused in the tradition, it's entirely understandable how you could have different versions in the Greek that one read orgisthemai, one get angry, one read have compassion on us. But what that suggests is that actually there was an earlier Aramaic version of this gospel, a written version, and Mark is inadvertently in this giving us a little bit of a window, a little bit of a glimpse into one word of what that must have been. So this suggests that there actually is a written Aramaic subtext that goes behind this that at least probably had this story and maybe quite a bit else. So Mark is actually quite fascinating in that way, in the ways in which he sometimes inadvertently, sometimes maybe intentionally gives us a window into what the earliest tradition really was.
I just looked at Gundry's Erdman's commentary, and he cites it, and he also cites, and I pulled up Cranfield, the older ICC commentary is very deep into it, and he goes deeper into it. So yeah,
right.
Yeah, one of the words is a form of it's used by Jesus in the Lazarus story, as he was deeply
Okay,
moved.
yeah.
Yeah, and
So
so
that's
there's
right. So
yeah,
as you go on in the story, and this is not a variant. This is I think the text people agreed upon. But when it says here, verse 43, he sternly charged him and sent him away at once, saying, "See that you say nothing to anybody, but go show yourself to the priest." Okay, but that word sternly is sternly is probably it's a little bit weak in terms of the translation. The word is embrimaomai, which literally means it's basically like the sound a horse makes when it kind of snorts like that. But when it's applied to a person, it almost means it seems to mean almost like snorting in outrage, almost like muttering cuss words under your breath or something like that. Like yes, something
not,
kind of
not
like
that our
that.
spouses have ever done that, nor have we ever done that to our spouses.
And so yeah, you don't want to launch an
Don't
expletive,
start at me, buddy.
This is like
Yeah.
kind of muttering it under your breath because you're really ticked off. And so this is a word that appears one time, I believe, in Mark's gospel. It might appear, but it appears. What's interesting is it also appears in John too, twice in the Lazarus story. And this is one of the many examples. And I don't want to get into this too much because this is a Synoptic course, but one of the many examples of where John seems to preserve a more primitive tradition himself, seemingly under Mark's influence, because this is originally a Markan word.
Yeah, most of the scholars on John believe that he had a copy or access to a text there.
And if we have a course on John too, and I think maybe one of the additions to that course will be bringing out more of the relationship between John and Mark, because there is a lot of interesting relationships that are not as well appreciated as the John and Luke relationships, which are also very important. But yeah, so that's another Markan primitivization of showing Jesus, actually being angry. There is one other time he does this, the withered hand story. He also gets angry there too, and that particular detail is excised from the Matthew and the Luke version. Luke in particular really wants Jesus to come across as a lot more stoic, a lot more philosophical, a lot more Socratic.
Different audience.
Not someone quite so passionate.
Not someone gonna burn the Roman Empire down or anything like that. So,
and of course, Matthew is interested in Jesus, particularly highlighting his sinlessness, and anger is, of course, not sinful per se, but it's a passion that can certainly lead to sin. So, these are areas that sort of get to a little bit closer to the boundary of what typically belongs in a Jesus portrait. And some people will say, well, cleansing the temple, he was angry. Well, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. It turns out in Mark's version, I think I might have mentioned this in the lesson. In Mark's version, he actually goes and looks around the day before. In Mark 11:11, he goes and checks the whole. He cases the joint basically in preparation. So he actually knew what he was going to do, right? So if he was angry, it was almost a performative kind of an outrage, because what Mark almost leads us to believe was that this was a kind of what we would call almost like a publicity stunt, like something you're really doing of a highly symbolic, highly provocative gesture,
a performance.
To get attention. And that's and of course, not surprisingly, this is one of the things that was led him to be crucified. That the blowback from that stunt. So, but at any rate,
as my late father used to always say, it's never the principle of the thing; it's always the money. So you can kind of look at it that way. Tell you what, Pete, this first week of walking through your writings and the references have been great. I feel like you just said that Mark is an overlooked gospel, and sometimes we run for others because we think there's more. There's more to mine from, and this has
Right.
certainly
Right.
shown the error of that. But
Right. Right.
so, thanks a lot, and we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye bye
Excellent.
now.
All right.